Thank you for tuning in to the third episode of our series where we build the website for OpenSource-Odyssey, the YouTube channel that you're watching this video on, and this website will be the hub for everything that is to come with OpenSource-Odyssey. In today's episode, we will install and configure yet another quality of developer life tool. I can already hear the people watching this video saying, well, come on, already write some code. But the thing is, if we imagine ourselves as Odysseus who is embarking on this open source Odyssey, it is really nice to have a good ship that we can sail on and meet all of the adventures that are to come on our way. This website is exactly this. So we want to build a good ship, and in order to build a good ship, we need good tools. So think about this tool I'm going to show you today as like sharpening the saw or whatever, so we can cut the wood very nicely. So we will configure T3Env, which is a package that helps us validate our environment variables. It does the validation with Zot, and Zot is almost the standard library nowadays for validating input, for example, from the user, but we can also use it to validate environment variables. And what happens when we do that is, on the one hand, we will run into less errors when we actually deploy our application. Maybe you've had this problem before, I sure have, that you build everything on develop and everything works great. Then you move to production, but you forgot one pesky environment variable that you totally have in your development env, but that's not present in the production env. And this can lead to all kinds of tricky issues that are maybe hard to debug. So to take care of that, how great would it be if during the build time of our application, when we transpile all of the TypeScript to JavaScript, we get errors that indicate which environment variables are missing. So this will show us the error super early and we can go right in and fix it. So that's great. The other benefit of validating our environment variables with something like Zot is type safety. So we can say, for example, a certain variable will be a Boolean, or it will be a number, or it will be a string. And Zot gives us also functions to coerce certain types, because naturally when you read in .env file, everything will be a string. But maybe you do need the port as a number, so in order, Zot can take care of this. And last but not least, T3Env gives us this great separation of client and server variables. When we're building a NextJS application, maybe sometimes the line can get a little bit blurry as to what is running on the client and what is running on the server. And of course, we don't want to expose secret information from the server, something like an API key, to the client. And T3Env just helps us have a clear separation, and it's just great. So all in all, 3 thumbs up from my side. Let's dive right in and take a look at T3Env. So here I am on the website for T3Env. The link should also be in the show notes if you want to follow along. You can read through all of this, the rationale behind it, the advantages. From my part, I already know the advantages and I gave you a little preview of it already. So what we want to do is jump right over to Next.js, because in the end, our payload application is just a Next.js application, and we want to run this installation command. So I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, pop a terminal. Let's make this a little bit bigger, cd into our open source Odyssey project, and then run the pnpm install command. So this will install T3, OSS, env, Next.js, and Zot, and now the installation is done. Let's keep reading through this a little bit. So it says we can use any schema validator, which is great. It requires a minimum of TypeScript 5. Let's quickly take a look into what version of TypeScript we are running. This will be found in the package JSON usually. So let's come here and search for TypeScript. We're on 5.7, so that's great. And finally, we have this indicator here that is an ESM only package. I guess we will maybe come back to this. In the past, when I was setting up T3Env, I sometimes had to use MJS files instead of TypeScript files, but let's see how that goes. So what I want to do first is take a look at what environment variables we already have. So we have our database URI, our unique resource identifier, which just maps to MongoDB, our local host, and then finally the name of the database in the end here. Then we have a randomly generated payload secret, our next public server URL, and this next public already indicates that this variable will also be read by the client. And then we have a secret for our cron job. We don't have a cron job configured yet. Maybe we'll do that later on. So I'm just going to scroll a little bit through the documentation here and take a look into how this is usually done. So we can create a env.ts file where we can write TypeScript code, so we can import Zod, and we can create envs like this. And this will run at the beginning of our Next.js application to validate that all the environment variables are there and that they are of the correct type. So this is the part I was alluding to earlier, that we can also split our schema definition for the environment variables into the server and the client. And this is also what we will do. So I guess our first step would be to come into our project here, go into the source directory and create a new folder called env, and then a server TS. Let's go with server TS first and try to see if this works. So alongside our server TS, we also need a client TS. Let's just make a comment here at the top so it's easier for us to understand what is which. And I'm going to be a little bit lazy. Let's just yoink this code here, come in here and paste it. And then let's give this a save. Now we need to do a little bit of adjustment for the actual variables that we have in here. So I'm going to split my pane and also open the env file that we currently have. So we have our database URI. In here it's called database URL. So let's replace this really quick to URI. It's going to be of type string and specifically a URL string. And we can also provide a default value here. I like to do this, so even in case we don't have this environment variable, we always have a fallback value. And I'm just going to paste the value that I currently have in my .env. Now we have our payload secret. This we want to paste, and also we can say it's a string as well. It should be at least, let's say, 5 characters long. And for here, let's also provide a default. Why not? So these defaults are kind of, if I don't have any variable set in my .env, Zod will not throw an error, but actually take the defaults. And since I'm developing here, this is just some quality of life. So the next public server URL, I don't want to paste in here because this is going to come in our client file down here. But let's also take this cron secret. And with this, I think I'm looking pretty good on the server side. So we have our 3 variables. Maybe let's come in here and sort this a little bit and make a comment here saying this is for the client. So it looks a little bit neater. I think that's going to do it for the server. In here, it's going to give us a meaningful comment that if we were to run on a Next.js version that is lower than 13, we would also have to pass the variables again and do a mapping between what we have in our .env file and the variables, let's say, that we declare up top here. But since I'm using Next.js 15, I can just do it like this, and so I can get rid of this comment here. Now let's take a look at the client configuration. For this, I'm also going to copy this code. Let's close the server and let's move this over so it looks a little bit nicer for us to work with. Then I can paste this here, and now we need to replace the clerk publishable key with our server URL. So let's do a little multi-cursor action and come in here and say server URL. So this will also be, we just saw this, it will also be a URL type, and I guess we don't need this minimum here. And what I was just mentioning that we don't have to do on the server, we do need to do on the client. So we do need to manually map our variable to this. And good thing I closed the window a little bit, because here we need to also replace this part. All right. So I think that does it for the naive implementation of our client and server TypeScript files. Now let's see if we can make this work. And it will only work if we also have a next config TS. Let's see what our next config is looking like. So we have a next config JS file, which is not going to do. I already know this because you cannot import TypeScript files into JS files. But we can work around this a little bit. And the way we do this is we rename the file from a JS to a MJS. So we rename our next config to MJS. And then we can also rename our client and server variables. Whoops. Let's go into the edit mode here. Little multi-cursor again. And this is going to be MJS now. Let's save it. And with this, I think we can just follow along again. So here it is telling us that we can import our files with this just-in-time interpreter. I think I've tried it at one point and it didn't work for me, so I will do it a little bit different. And the way I'm doing it is I already have my files as MJS. So this means I can import the client and the server MJS with no problem into this next config MJS. All we need to do for this is we do a little await import and then pass the file path of our environment variables. So this would be, we are in the root of our project. So we go to source. Maybe let's give it also a dot at the beginning. Then we have env, and now we have our server MJS. And let's do the same thing with our client MJS. All right, so let's take a look and see if this is already working. And maybe let's just do a npm dev to see if our application starts up. So here we don't have any problems, which is great. Let's come out here and open localhost 3000. It's going to take a little bit to compile. And with that, we are back to our very simple site that we created in the first episode. Now, we want to see if it's actually working. So let's remove one of the env variables that we currently have, and let's see if we get thrown an error. And I guess in order for this to work, I also have to remove the default from the environment variable. Whoops, this is the wrong file. So server MJS. Let's remove the default here for now. So put this down one line, comment it out. The formatting is a little bit weird. And look at that. So I'm starting the development server and it crashes immediately and I get then an error saying invalid environment variables. So if I scroll up a little bit, we can see a very descriptive error. The cron secret environment variable is missing. It is required and therefore our entire application crashes. So we get a nice warning that what we are trying to do here is incorrect and we will run into issues down the line. So it's way better to get stopped right at the start, go in and fix it instead of having to find out about this later on when the cron service is not working somehow. So let's go back, comment this back in. Let's see if this works. If I just leave in the default, does it work now? Yeah, so now it works again. You can see the default is kind of overriding this required thing. So maybe if you are taking it to production, it's not so nice to have these defaults. For my purposes now, it's okay. I also need to remove this right here. All right, so let's come back in here and comment this in. Great. So this is the configuration and setup of T3Env. We get now all of the benefits that we need to get. So What I need to do now is actually replace the calls to process-env with the calls to my environment variable files. So here I am in the heart of my payload app, the payload config, and let's look for a process-env that we have here. All right, excellent example. So here we are initializing our database connector, and currently we are saying, okay, we want to use Mongoose, the MongoDB adapter, and we want to pass in this database URI. And if it's undefined, then we will pass an empty string. Well, now with our new package set up and installed, this is unnecessary because we know our application will not even start if we don't have the database URI set. So what we can do now is we can clean this up a little bit. This will no longer be coming from process-env. Instead, we only have env, and we need to import it. And my code editor doesn't suggest this to me. Let's do it manually. Like once I do it once, it will remember this and remember the import. So this is going to come from the source, then our newly created env directory, and then the server MJS. And the cool thing with MJS files is that we can also import them into TypeScript files. So this is kind of the in-between layer for our things. And now if I hover over this database URI and look at the type, I can see it is a string, and it's not even maybe string or undefined. It is a string for sure, because that's how we typed it in the Zod schema. So this is great. Let's do the same thing with the PayloadEnv. And here I already have my import at the top, so I just need to remove the process-env at the start here. Let's go also to the cron secret, and that does it for this payload config file. Now I will do a little bit of speed up and just run through the entire project and replace the process.env with my env import from server MJS. I don't have the node.env in my environment variable file yet, so let's quickly add this. I'm going to come to the server MJS and add the node.env, and this can only be really one of two values. So I'm going to choose a TypeScript enum, so it can either be development or it can be production. And here I'm also going to give a default of development. And we will never have this Vercel production URL, so we're not going to use Vercel. So here we are at the get URL utilities file, and I can see there are a lot of stuff with this Vercel production URL. I'm just going to get rid of all of these because we're not going to use Vercel. And now, since this is coming from the client, you can see this by the next public, we need to set our import from the client MJS. Oops. Oh. Same here. Also going to import this from the client MJS and get rid of the Vercel entirely. And I think that's going to do it. I have some remaining calls to process env. So 2 are in the README. We don't care about this, obviously. Then we have some in the NextJS config. And I think here we can do a little bit more cleanup. So let's get rid of the Vercel stuff and just leave in this right here. I'm going to leave this in because I don't have explicitly destructured from the client here. So I think like this is okay. And then the other calls to process env are in this com.js sitemap config. I'm going to leave it, but I'm nevertheless going to get rid of the Vercel stuff as well. And like this, our project is looking much cleaner. And let's just verify that everything is still running correctly. So this is looking good. The server is starting up. I would say let's commit our changes and call it a day. So first up, I'm going to add my client and server MJS as well as the next config. Let's add the change here. Also, we need to add the changes of installing the T3Env package as well as Zod. And let's call this, commit this, and let's call it add T3Env package plus configuration. And for the second thing, I'm going to do a commit of all of the rest. So let's stage all of these files and let's say refactor, switch out process env with T3Env and give this a commit as well. Then I'm going to push it, enter the password of my SSH key. And with that, we have made 2 new commits to our Git repository. So here on our Git repository, you can see that we've made changes just now, and it includes now the configuration and switch from process env to T3Env. And with that, I think we are all set up. So we have our tools sharpened. And in the next videos, we will actually dig into the source code of our payload project and do some changes to get where we want to go. Thank you for tuning in. Leave a sub if you liked the video and if you want to see what is to come. See you then. Onwards, cypherpunks.